All right, friends, we're about to start. I'm about to introduce our extraordinarily outstanding final speaker. My name is Carter Snead. You may remember me from such conferences as this fall conference. The director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. No. Stop. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce my very dear friend, Professor John O'Callaghan. Professor O'Callaghan is Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Notre Dame, where he works on Thomistic metaphysics, Thomistic ethics, and medieval philosophy. From 2006 till 2023, he served as director of Notre Dame's Maritain Center, the university's flagship center for the study of Thomistic philosophy since its founding in 1957. John is a permanent member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas and has served on the faculty of Notre Dame since 2003, where he also completed his doctorate. He is currently at work on a volume exploring the concept of misericordia, of compassionate mercy, entitled Mercy Beyond Justice. Tonight, Professor O'Callaghan will help us consider the question, are there failed persons? Am I one of them? Please join me in welcoming Professor John O'Callaghan.
Well, thank you. Before I start, I just wanted to say, and I think they're trying to make their way in, I'd like to acknowledge David Solomon, not only the founder that Carter has so magnificently continued the work of the center that he founded, but also he and his wife Lou, who are Mary and my oldest and deepest, closest friends here at Notre Dame. And it was David who showed me the seriousness of doing ethics well in a different key than it is typically done in many academic institutions, particularly in the English-speaking world. However good those things might be, David's seriousness about the pursuit of ethics was a model to me, and I hope I don't embarrass him tonight. Also like to thank Carter, my twin brother of a different mother. He's Italian, I'm Irish. He's short, I'm tall, we're both kind of pudgy. And he's showing me the way to being bald. With dignity. Also, Margaret and Laura and the entire staff of the DeNicola Center, it is just a marvelous thing to be up there. And I'd like to also mention the joy I have in seeing all the Soren Fellows. I work up there pretty much every day, and to see them up there is just extraordinary and marvelous. Just one second. Finally, and I hope this doesn't count against my time, because I know there will be catering after, I'd like to dedicate this paper or talk to Alistair McIntyre and just mention, I know people have talked about it and so on, but this is the first time in the 23 years that Alistair has not spoken at this conference. I'm kind of hoping that one of the volumes the center will publish, but he probably won't give permission, is all those marvelous talks he gave. And I could not have written this. He'll find many problems with it, I assure you. I could not have written this except for the way in which reading his book, Dependent Rational Animals, changed my intellectual outlook on things. So this is for Alistair. And then also, for those of you who were here last year, because he's not speaking this year, I'm going to do my best to say something that appears to be a heresy. But isn't. So the heresy hunters online should pay attention. That we were formed, then sayest thou, and the work of secondary hands by task transferred from father to his son. Strange point and new. Doctrine which we would know whence learnt, who saw when this creation was. Rememberest thou thy making while the Maker gave thee being? We know no time when we were not as now. Know none before us, self-begot, self-raised. Are there failed persons? Most certainly. But to begin to think about what a failed person is, consider a curious confluence of two opinion columns in the Washington Post appearing over 2 consecutive days. The first was by Mark Thiessen, a political conservative. It took note of the awful rates of abortion of children diagnosed prenatally with Down syndrome in places like Iceland, practically 100%, Denmark 98%, and the United States 67%. Thiessen asked, when will we stop killing human beings with Down syndrome? The basis of his argument was the achievements of human beings with Down syndrome that we see reported in the news, achievements like Karen Gaffney swimming the English Channel and so on. In virtue of these achievements, he argued that these human beings ought to be valued and included within our society rather than killed. The very next day, Ruth Marcus, a political liberal, took the opposite position as she wrote a column unapologetically, indeed proudly entitled, "I would have aborted a fetus with Down syndrome. Women need that right." She took note of the diminished cognitive capacities and increased health problems that often accompany Down syndrome, as well as the lowered expectations we can have for what such human beings can achieve. Within 5 sentences, she flatly contradicted herself, writing first that, and I quote, "Certainly to be a parent is to take the risks that accompany parenting. You love your child for who she is, not what you want her to be." End of quotation. Almost immediately, however, after 3 sentences describing the difficulties associated with Down syndrome and presumably imagining a child of hers receiving a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome, Marcus wrote, and I quote, "I'm going to be blunt here. That was not the child I wanted." End of quotation. So despite what she had earlier claimed, it is, after all, that loving the child or killing her depends upon what we want her to be, what we want her to achieve. One can't help but suspect a kind of cheap grace in affirming the love of your child for who she is rather than what you want her to be, so long as you did, in fact, get what you wanted. Mark Thiessen is opposed to abortion in general, even apart from the argument about achievement that he made in his column. He may simply have thought that given his audience in the Washington Post, he was giving a rhetorically powerful argument about human beings with Down syndrome. But as a rhetorical strategy, it simply underscores all the more a point I'm trying to make. Why would he think that rhetorical strategy effective? Sometimes adopting a rhetorical strategy does nothing other than fundamentally reaffirm the social context that is in fact the root of the problem one wants to address. In this case, it is our valorization of other human beings for what they achieve, and associating their worth or dignity with what we value, what we want in ourselves and in those with whom we want to associate. Here we can speak of a community of moral concern or value. It consists of those human beings whom we think we have moral obligations toward and responsibility for. The very practical question for a society that kills human beings is who is a member of that community of moral concern and who is not. It is here that the notion of person often comes into play. It is here that the notion of person often comes into play, particularly in the field of bioethics. The term person effectively sets the boundary of the we, of the us. C.S. Lewis's phrase, inner ring, is an apt expression for capturing what is going on here. We want to know what the boundary of the inner ring of persons is. We are persons with all the inherent dignity moral weight and worth that status implies, and with the boundary that the term person erects, we can consider what a failed person might be. Presumably, it's the human beings outside the inner ring of moral concern, those who fail to have the dignity of a person, to have moral weight and worth. It's simply a sociological fact that in both contemporary culture and philosophy, the term person is very often, indeed almost always, used to mark out the community of human beings who have rights that must be respected and cannot be violated, human beings whom we think we should care for by providing them with enough to eat, with shelter, education, health care, keeping them safe from crime and poverty. Failure to provide for these things is thought to be an offense against their dignity as persons. However, there's a flip side to that use of the term. There is widespread, if not universal, agreement that not all human beings are persons. Some human beings fail to be persons. Such non-person human beings bear no rights and may in particular be killed, without the question of justice ever arising for or about them. So despite the warm and fuzzy sound of the phrase human dignity that one hears, effectively, dignity rides piggyback upon being a person, not upon being a human being. This construction of an inner ring of persons and moral concern is not confined simply to questions of abortion. It extends more broadly to questions of infanticide and euthanasia. Historically, it played a role in undergirding the legal structure of slavery in the United States. Sadly, there are many other examples that can be cited for the exclusion of some human beings from the inner ring of persons. My examples here will focus upon the killing of human beings as the clearest cases. But the notion of person as marking out the community of moral concern and dignity also spills over, at least culturally, if not always philosophically, to the goods that we owe to those human beings whose lives we do not happen to value. For example, in drawing a distinction between the deserving and the undeserving poor, or attitudes we take toward prisoners who have committed terrible crimes, immigrants, legal or otherwise. Even if in theory we would never explicitly dream of denying that they are human persons, never suggest that we may wantonly kill them, in practice, through social and cultural attitudes and practices of depersonalization, we often treat them as failed persons anyway, and as outside the community of moral concern. What is the content of this cultural philosophical concept of a person? Think of what people mean when they say of someone very old who suffers from the extremes of dementia or some debilitating disease or condition often referred to as a persistent vegetative state. One often hears people say, "That isn't the person I knew. The person I knew and loved is gone." They seem to be saying the human being with whom I lived a life, who engaged me in various different ways having to do with ordinary cognitive and volitional functioning, speaking with me, playing with me, eating with me, perhaps making love with me, raising children with me, no longer does so and is incapable of doing so. Heartrending as these circumstances undoubtedly are, and they are, the human being is judged to be a person or not by what he or she does not achieve in relation to what we value in life. The notion of person here is a psychological notion because it tends to emphasize the manifestation of cognitive and volitional capacities in human action. It involves the ready capacity to express cognitive and volitional acts. It is social because first, it tends to emphasize the ways in which the human beings engage other human beings through these cognitive and volitional capacities. And second, because it emphasizes expressions of cognitive and volitional capacities that we, the community of moral concern, find valuable. So there's a distinction to be made between, on the one hand, what we might call the metaphysical question of when a human being is or becomes a person related to the presence of healthy cognitive and volitional capacities, and on the other hand, the moral significance placed upon these psychological capacities, determined by various social attitudes towards them, as well as their relative strength and health. How healthy and strong must those capacities be, as manifested to us, to count for determining the circle of moral concern, the circle of human persons versus the circle of failed human persons? And do not forget that even if the poor, the prisoner, or the immigrant meet the metaphysical criterion of being a person, if we never bother to speak to them as persons, they might as well be failed persons. Their depersonalization consists in the ways we prevent them from being heard, from manifesting the intellectual and volitional capacities they possess. If we said hello to them, we might end up having to hear them say hello back. And then what would we do? Think of yourselves listening to me now, and think of me speaking to you now as paradigmatic instances of social psychological persons. But the example could just as well be eating dinner with one another, playing football, or Swifties, watching Taylor Swift, watching Travis Kelce excel on the gridiron while leaning into his mother. All exemplary instances in our culture of social psychological persons manifesting their personhood to one another. On this notion of being a person, a human being is a person only if he or she can readily exhibit a certain level of performance with respect to normal human activities characterized by reason and will, typically activities we value. The clearest use of this social psychological notion of person is no doubt to be found within contemporary philosophy and bioethics. It's fair to say that within these academic disciplines, arguments for the moral legitimacy of such things as abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and eugenics are dominated by some form of this social psychological notion of a person. The most famous philosopher in the field of bioethics is undoubtedly Peter Singer of Princeton University. Here is how he argues for the infanticide of human beings born with Down syndrome in his book, Rethinking Life and Death. To have a child with Down syndrome is to have a very different experience from having a normal child. It can still be a warm and loving experience, but we must have lowered expectations of our child's abilities. We cannot expect a child with Down syndrome to play the guitar, to develop an appreciation of science fiction, to learn a foreign language, to chat with us about the latest Woody Allen movie, or to be a respectable athlete, basketballer, clearly grew up in Australia or New Zealand, whichever one it is. Basketballer, who says that? Or tennis player. The Gen Z movie buffs may not fully appreciate the reference to Woody Allen. Think Christopher Nolan. Singer goes on to argue that animated by concern for the parents' well-being as seekers of children, the parents ought to be able to engage in infanticide with the assistance of the medical community in order that they may try again to get the child they wanted, a child capable of performing and achieving success along these lines. As a simple matter of fact, Singer is wrong about the abilities of human beings with Down syndrome. As many engage in these activities, the point that Thiessen emphasized, only those who are generally ignorant of the lives of people with Down syndrome would think they cannot. And we may ask why so many in our society are so ignorant of those lives that they can just hear these claims and simply knowingly nod, indeed condescendingly nod, as if in wonder. Why do the achievements of people with Down syndrome seem so newsworthy to us? Frankly, it's because culturally we have such low expectations of them in terms of achievements we value. We've already tacitly excluded them from the community of moral concern that we engage in our lives. We don't care to know. So it surprises us when someone decides that it's newsworthy, and we grant ourselves cheap grace in being so welcoming of the newsworthy events in the lives of human beings we otherwise are pretty ignorant of. In any case, the presuppositions of this passage of Singer's broadly align with the Washington Post's columnists' arguments about abortion, now transposed to infanticide. The case is to be determined upon the basis of performance and what parents want in and from their children, No matter that Singer's list of achievements expresses a particularly Western and bourgeois attitude toward human excellence and value. Tennis. Woody Allen movies. It may be killed because we can't expect it to ever excel at pickleball. It's not just bourgeois, but ridiculously academically hoity-toity. I picture being in the Princeton Faculty Club and hearing, "Say, Dash, look, it's that Down syndrome ball boy. You know, Sebastian and Olivia's kid. I've always wondered why they didn't kill it when it was born. I mean, it can't really do anything of value, you know? Well, anyway, your serve. Oh, ball boy, would you bring me a towel for my racket?" I kind of think some people will be offended by that example. Offended for the wrong reasons, but I certainly hope so. Notice the way that this social psychological measure of human value shapes our understanding of the goal of medicine. The disease that medicine is to address is not really Down syndrome, the presence of an extra 21st chromosome in a child that has been conceived. The disease or pathology calling for our moral concern is the parent's inability to produce the child they want. A child who will perform up to their French-speaking, Ursula K. Le Guin reading, Christopher Nolan watching, LeBron James standards. The parents, in conceiving such a child, suffer from a pathology. It is the task of medicine to cure the parents of that pathology, giving the parents another chance for success by first killing off their bad seed. Down syndrome isn't the disease here. Being a producer of such a human being is. On this view of medicine, the field of obstetrics is a kind of pre- and postnatal cosmetic surgery for parents. The fact is that an extraordinary amount of the philosophical discussion of personhood that takes place in contemporary secular philosophy, especially in bioethics, is in service to expanding the scope of human beings who may be killed by restricting the scope of human beings who are judged to be persons. When the question of killing isn't on the table, moral and political philosophers typically talk simply about rational and autonomous individuals. But when we dig down into what is meant by a rational and autonomous individual, it turns out to be pretty much the same as a mostly independent individual with the ready capacity to engage in sophisticated cognitive and volitional capacities. For the philosophers of killing, it is pretty evident to most that there are human beings that are not persons and that may be killed, because having no prospect of achieving that independent rational autonomy, that's the end of the first part, which I forgot to tell you the title of was, they give a name to the winners of the world. This is called I Want a Name When I Lose. I'd like to argue that we should abandon this social psychological notion of personhood. One difficulty with it, even for those who advocate it, is that it allows too much killing. For example, it allows for the killing of those who are in a comatose state. Comas are not typically persistent, although they can be. But someone in a coma does not have the ready capacity to engage in sophisticated cognitive and volitional capacities. They can't speak their own language, much less a foreign language. Can't play pickleball. They can't even bring us towels for our rackets. Like any infant, they can't feed themselves. Even more, there's a huge class of human beings who fail to be persons on the social psychological account. A class of human beings that dwarfs the class of the demented, the vegetative, the cognitively impaired, the sick, the blind, the halt, and the withered. That class is the class of healthy human infants who have been born but are pre-linguistic. In theory, the social psychological criterion of personhood allows for the killing of healthy human infants, up until, at the latest, sometime roughly in the middle and usually later part of the second year after birth, when language use begins to appear, although it's not of a particularly sophisticated sort. Healthy infants don't have the ready capacity to manifest sophisticated capacities for cognitive and volitional activity along the lines of Singer's criteria. any more than the severely cognitively impaired do. It might even extend out to at least to the age of 3 or beyond. Because, as Singer and others, it's not just him, Singer and others point out they point out that talking to 2 and 3-year-olds indicates they don't have very sophisticated concepts of having a significant future or of what death is. You don't understand what death is, so we can kill you. Lacking such concepts, newborns and toddlers are human beings without being social psychological persons. And but for rationally unjustified and negative social prejudice against killing little kids, they are ripe for being culled. As I suggested above, the social psychological criterion even has moral, if not metaphysical, spillover into our treatment of those human beings we must acknowledge are persons according to the criterion, but whom we refuse to listen to: the poor, the imprisoned, the immigrant. In practice, even if we think we can't kill most of them, who are they to us if we do not acknowledge them and do not then admit them to the inner ring of moral concern? Admit them by allowing them to manifest to us their cognitive and volitional capacities. Maybe we can't kill them, but perhaps we can just leave them to die in a ditch along the road. Somebody somewhere once said, "For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart." I could go on, but we should simply reject this social psychological notion of personhood. We should recognize, on the contrary, that all human beings are persons in a more fundamental sense upon which the social psychological sense rides like a parasite. Consider the moral obligations we do think we have toward those human beings amongst us who are healthy. That is, let us adopt a less idealized and abstract perspective on the phenomenon of the moral character of our lives than that of the ideal we find in much of modern moral philosophy, the ideal of independent, self-directed, rational autonomy. I want you to notice that the specifically moral character of our lives is, in fact, primarily engaged in our relation to others, whether those others are human beings, dolphins, birds, or even fighting Irishmen. In addition, whatever ideal of autonomy is put forward by modern moral philosophy, in reality, any such autonomy is an autonomy conditioned by dependence upon others. In reality, we live our lives not as ideally autonomous agents, but as agents dependent upon and among one another, engaging one another well or badly. Some measure of autonomy might be achieved in this or that activity or context, which is a good thing, depending upon the activity or context. You, not ChatGPT, should write your paper. However, it's not a human failure to co-author a paper, except perhaps at tenure review. A realistic assessment of such instances of autonomy will recognize the extent to which they are at the very least enabled and conditioned, if not determined, by our dependence upon one another. We should not think of this more fundamental dependence upon one another for almost everything we do as a bad thing to be overcome, that one is not a person unless one has achieved the ideal of rational autonomy. If rational autonomy is a goal and a good to be pursued by human beings, it can only be so for human beings who are already moral agents, directed to the pursuit of that goal, conditioned and directed to it by what they already are, human beings. We are not human persons because we have crossed some threshold of development of capacities of reason and will, or become rational autonomous agents. We are human persons because, being human, we are already, from the beginning of our lives, set upon a course of development that includes, as stages of development, the development of those rational and volitional capacities and many others besides, necessarily developed in communion with one another. But now I wanted to focus upon the fact that the specifically moral character of our lives becomes more engaged when we attend to human weakness rather than strength. There are all sorts of moral attitudes we take and actions we express that we do not really notice when dealing with the healthy. Smiling at a friend when he walks into the room, making dinner for one's family, answering a roommate's question about the physics exam tomorrow, not insisting on the 51st installment of the Marvel series movie to go to this weekend, but allowing one's friend to decide for once to go to the latest Christopher Nolan movie. Attending a football game to watch the Packers beat the Bears yet again. Even praying for the Bears as I do. God knows they need prayers and lots of them. Because these are human actions, they are moral actions. However, we experience ourselves much more explicitly as moral agents when confronted with weakness, when confronted with the question of whether to help or to turn away. A flight I was supposed to be on was delayed half a day because Delta had not arranged for a pilot for the plane. It was a bit of a struggle, but I did my best to be pleasant to the woman at the gate, respecting her role, her advice, thanking her as I left. I didn't self-consciously experience myself as a moral agent then and there, even though I was in fact acting as one. Only later upon reflection did it occur to me that such a situation is both a reminder of my own dependence upon others and also a context for expressing myself well or badly as a moral agent in my condition of dependence. But every time I have walked by a beggar on the streets, I have explicitly and self-consciously experienced myself as a moral agent, but by what I do in stopping or walking by in the face of another's dependence and suffering. Just before COVID struck, I was in Calcutta, India, to volunteer, and saw a child of maybe 3 years old squatting and defecating well out into a busy street in the midst of the commercial district, traffic flying by, with apparently no one caring for him. I walked by in anguish. Someone later asked me, "What did you do?" I had to say nothing. What could I do? The next day I walked by what looked like a dead man's body sprawled face down on the sidewalk, surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of people going about their business. Again, I walked by in anguish. My anguish wasn't simply at the plight of the child or the man who may have died as he lay in the sidewalk. It was anguish at my own moral impotence. My moral impotence in those circumstances amplifies my point about how we are dependent upon one another to pursue the moral character of our lives. What could I do? I had no idea how I could get help in this city so foreign to me. If I pulled that child out of the street, what then? His fundamental problem was not defecating in the street, awful though that is. It was likely and remains his homelessness, which was not unique to him there. There were tens of thousands of Indians around in the streets, going about enjoying what was an Indian holiday. What would have happened to me if I, the only white person in the vast crowd, was seen picking up an Indian child and walking away with him, even if only to take him to the Missionaries of Charity where I was headed? These people wouldn't know that. They would see a white Westerner carrying away an Indian boy. But whom could I ask for help? How do I even ask for help? Who do I turn to get the body of the dead man off the sidewalk and taken care of? The police collect those dead bodies. How do I call the police? How do I even ask to call the police? I walked by in my moral impotence. The point here is not that someone was dependent upon me as an object of my high-minded benevolence and beneficence, and that I failed. I did fail. But the point is that in all of that misery around me, my moral failure was in large part due to the fact that through my own fault, I had no one to help me to act well as the moral agent I would like to be. As a moderately rational and autonomous individual, I thought I could go there by myself. The fact is, we aren't just dependent upon one another in times of our own physical, psychological, or economic distress, but also in our pursuit of moral strength and excellence. We can't even be morally good without one another. unless we severely limit the scope of moral concern by closing our eyes to the wide range of human suffering and the need to address it. But how can we be morally good if we do close our eyes? For my heart has grown dull, and my ears I can barely hear, and my eyes I have closed. I'm not suggesting that there's an easy answer as to what to do when one encounters a beggar, although one should engage him in some fashion. I wish I did not know that there is no easy answer when one walks by a dead body lying in the sidewalk. But I want to emphasize the way that our own moral weakness appearing so concretely before us in these circumstances amplifies for us our character as moral agents and calls for a response in a way that ordinary encounters with relatively stable, healthy, and strong individuals and groups do not. After all, anyone who sits on the street begging for money is suffering from some sort of weakness, even if in a particular case, as sometimes happens, it's not the weakness of financial poverty. I think you will agree that it is the reality of the moral in our lives, not our experience of it, that matters. That reality of the moral comes out most strongly in the ways in which we encounter those who need our aid most: the weak, the impaired, the hungry, the neighbor or stranger looking for help, the dying. Not just the deserving poor, but also the undeserving poor. It is precisely the depth of the moral character of life in the circumstances of encountering weakness that should make us realize how our lives in pursuit of moral goodness depend upon our common life as human beings. I need you, your moral strength, if I ever have a chance or hope of becoming good. If you are weak, so also will I be. When others are healthy and strong, our moral lives, if we act well, have a kind of unnoticed grace because of the ease with which we live amongst one another. But depending on how we engage those who are weak and suffering, the ease with which we ordinarily act, our moral character, can very easily appear to be something like what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace, a cheap morality that is fortunate enough never to be confronted by real need. On the other hand, when others are ill and weak, the character of our lives, if we act well, takes on a kind of deep and rich grace that penetrates to the core of our existence as moral agents. Indeed, to act badly here is precisely to turn away from moral depth to moral superficiality, out of fear, selfishness, or other forms of moral distraction and weakness that tear us apart from one another. A bit of advice I should have given myself. I ought not to go to places like Calcutta if I'm unprepared to face my own moral superficiality and the moral superficiality of the society I come from, my own inner ring. But I don't just have to avoid Calcutta. I also have to avoid parts of downtown South Bend or rural Michigan. Maybe I'll have to avoid a couple living next door whose suffering is not economic, but a kind of unrelenting, quiet desperation, happily unknown to me, their neighbor. I've certainly done my best to avoid visiting the St. Joseph County Jail, where the undeserving certainly live. But if I'm right about the depth of moral character we manifest when we act well in the face of the suffering we encounter, then we move and advance toward human perfection the more we move toward those who suffer. So let's return to the healthy infants, who are not persons on the social psychological criterion of personhood, to see why we should reject wholesale that notion. Notice that even if one said healthy human infants are not persons, no one would say they are failed persons. We do in fact believe we have moral obligations to this class of human beings who do not count as social psychological persons. We can't kill them to satisfy our desires for a different child. We have to feed them. We have to clothe them. We have to shelter them. Even most of the philosophers of killing would be shocked at the killing of healthy infants or the failure to assist them. Why then do we have these obligations? The advocates of the social psychological notion will likely answer that we have them precisely because they are healthy human infants who will develop into social psychological persons if everything goes according to plan. A favorite statement employed in that discussion is that they, quote, have interests and a valuable future ahead of them. Now, we can all agree that human life, like all human life, is dynamic and developmental. But this response from the philosophers of killing is ad hoc and essentially gives up the game for the social psychological notion of person, because it acknowledges that being a social psychological person is actually derivative upon something more fundamental than the ready capacity for cognitive and volitional acts. Being a social psychological person does not come from nowhere, as if by metaphysical magic, and I always think of the song, "This magic moment, I'm a person." It's a developmental stage in the life of a particular kind of animal, a human animal. So the moral obligations we have towards others who are healthy are not grounded in their being social psychological persons, but in their being the particular kind of animal they are, human beings, who with assistance and in the absence of impediments may well develop the ready capacities for cognitive and volitional activity so highly valued by the philosophers of killing. However, if what I said above about the depth and grace of the moral character of our lives as human beings is correct, we must recognize that the moral obligations that we have toward one another become deeper and greater insofar as we engage those who are ill, impoverished, homeless, alone, cognitively and volitionally impaired in some way. Those whose lives impinge upon and threaten the boundaries and borders of our inner ring. We cannot understand these forms of suffering as forms of suffering, except insofar as we understand those involved to be human beings. The notion of illness is just as much grounded in the nature of what we are as human beings as is health. To be ill or suffering in some way is to be in a condition one ought not to be in, given what one is, a human being rather than an earthworm, a bat, or a dolphin. A human being suffers because he cannot but should be able to do what he is conceived and born to do. Much more is required of our moral depth in engaging his suffering than is required in engaging his sister's health. That greater moral depth is required of us precisely because he's a human being, just like his healthy sister. These moral obligations to others are not grounded in their social psychological personhood, nor grounded in their possibilities of success in our inner ring of bourgeois circus acts, but in something more fundamental. These obligations are grounded in the nature of being human, against which health and illness, prosperity and destitution, and much else besides, are understood and measured as good and bad. In addition, we have moral obligations towards human beings whose suffering we cannot in fact ameliorate or fix, and perhaps may never be able to do. Minimally, we have the obligation to care for them by abiding with them in their suffering, suffering with them, adopting their suffering as our own. I don't mean the cheap grace of, "I feel your pain." It is their actual suffering that matters, not how sympathetic I may be in experiencing a pain of my own at the sight of them. To adopt the suffering of another as our own is precisely what the term compassion means etymologically: suffering with. Friendship is often described in its highest form as adopting the good of another as one's own. However, as Thomas Aquinas argues, the nature of human friendship is such that you cannot adopt the good of someone else as your own if you are not willing to adopt his or her suffering as well. Where there is no compassion, there is only failed friendship. And so Aquinas repeats for us Augustine's definition of mercy, or misericordia: a suffering heart moved by compassion for those who suffer, that acts to the extent possible to alleviate the suffering. But notice, even if one is unable to alleviate the suffering, misericordia is still expressed in compassionate suffering with, abiding with the one who suffers precisely in her suffering. Here, a different, more defensible notion of a human person arises than we find in the social psychological notion. A human person is an individual animal of a certain kind or nature ordinarily characterized by stages of development that include the expression of rational and volitional capacities displayed in various animal-type activities. Even if a human person is impaired with respect to the exercise of, or even lacks the ready capacity to engage in rational and volitional activity, he or she remains a human person who is by that very fact suffering. He or she remains a member of the community of moral concern that cannot be killed. No human being can fail to be a person. There is no inner ring of persons, except in our pathological cultural imaginings and bad philosophy. That said, I do think that a human being can be a failed person. The sophistical tap dancing now. There's an ambiguity in my title. Think about it. To be a failed chess player, you first have to be a chess player. To be a failed philosopher like me, you first have to be a philosopher. And to be a failed person, you first have to be a person. The ambiguities between failing to be a person and failing as a person. On the criterion I'm proposing, no human being can fail to be a person. However, even if I can't fail to be a person, I can fail as a person. There are goals human beings pursue precisely because they are persons. Walking to the store, making love to their wives or husbands, worshiping God. These are achievements that give expression to the reality of being a human person because they proceed from the capacity to understand these human goods and to will to put order into the pursuit of them. That role of reason in our lives as human beings is the minuscule element of truth in the otherwise failed concept of a social psychological person. But if I am prevented from, if I cannot bring reason and will to bear upon those goals for some reason, then I don't fail. I am a person who for some reason cannot pursue the goals of a person. Would we say a chess player is a failed chess player if, for example, someone stole her board, or she was called away by the sickness of her child, or she was knocked unconscious? No, she has not failed as a chess player. Similarly, the very young human being, the very old, the severely cognitively impaired are all persons, but they are not failed person because precisely as persons, they are prevented for various reasons from acting and succeeding as persons. Think about this for a minute and tell me if it's a riddle or the plainest truth on earth. Hard as you may try, there's nothing you can do to prevent an earthworm from winning at chess. Riddle or plain truth? You can only prevent a chess player from winning at chess. So there are two necessary preconditions to fail as a person. First, you have to be a person. Second, you cannot be in the condition of being prevented for some reason from acting as one. The rest of our failure is up to us. So who then might be failed persons? To answer that question with a little more depth than simply acknowledging our ordinary failures as persons, I want to focus upon one feature of the lives of human persons that is necessary to any success as persons. I have claimed that it is almost impossible to think of an activity we engage in as persons that does not involve dependence upon other human beings for its accomplishment, however much its accomplishment may most properly belong to an individual, including what we consider our most morally serious acts. A clear-sighted vision of reality requires that we acknowledge our dependence upon others for what we achieve and for our success if we succeed, depending upon others both for the necessary preconditions of our success, but also as jointly pursuing with us that success. This feature of our lives as dependent upon one another for success as persons can properly be described as a life of friendship and solidarity with one another. Friendship and solidarity precisely in our dependence upon one another, in our weakness and in our vulnerability, not despite it. Our mutual vulnerability is what makes possible the great good of human dignity. Human dignity, which is nothing other than to be destined to human friendship and solidarity. If I'm right, just as we are persons because we are human, we are also friends because we are human. Being a friend to the human beings we encounter in life is no more a choice we make than is being a person. It is the condition of our lives. But who is my friend, you will ask? Who's my neighbor? The answer to those questions is not determined by our choice. We are conceived and born into human personhood, which just is to be conceived and born into human friendship. The nature of being a human person is simply identical to the nature of being a friend. To understand this truth, we must no doubt rethink our concepts of both personhood and friendship. Rethink them in ways more responsive to the conditions of human existence than our culture and our philosophers will typically allow. Still, even though as persons we cannot choose who our friends are, being a friend is something we can succeed or fail at, because the unchosen friendship we are conceived for and born to finds expression through specifically human activity, moral and political reasoning that concludes to the possibility of killing the weak, the vulnerable and dependent, the undeserving, is moral reasoning that aims at the destruction of natural human friendship and solidarity. When we act to destroy the weak, the vulnerable, the dependent among us, we act to destroy our friends. In so doing, we act to destroy the possibility for our own success as persons. In a way, we act to destroy, even kill ourselves. Yes, there are failed persons. Looking for such failed persons, we should not go looking among the very old and the severely impaired, the weak and the lame, the undeserving. We should look within ourselves, within the inner ring of the winners of the world. I should look in the mirror and ask whether I see the face of a person who is a friend to these other human persons, these other friends, the weak, the suffering, the undeserving. The greatest, most successful human person, the most successful friend, is the friend who gives the most help to those human beings most in need, because she has used her reason and will to acknowledge that she is already bound in compassion to them in their need. The only person who ever chose human friendship was Jesus Christ, although that was really no choice even for him. Sound like a heresy? The rest of us have no choice at all. We can only choose to live our friendship with them, to live up to our human dignity. So my success as a human person is bound to those who suffer, bound to them as to my friends. I want to name when I lose. When I look in the mirror, I will only see a successful person if I have first learned to recognize the face of a person in my natural friends, the weak, the vulnerable, the severely impaired, the suffering, the lonely, the dispossessed, the undeserving. All those friends who do not count as social psychological persons for much of contemporary philosophical and ethical thought. A failed person is a person whose face is not the face of compassion and mercy. Am I a failed person? Well, look at my face and tell me what you see. Do you see the face of mercy? The face of misericordia? If not, then I'm a failed person. But I want to name what I lose. So what will you call me? Damned? Thank you for listening.